This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1103, a conversation with Jim Beard.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. This is episode 1103. I'm your host, Adam Chapman, and this is a conversation with Jim Beard. Jim has written many books. He's written extensively about comics, and he has a new book that just came out in June called Jack of All Comics, a fan conversation about the King of Comics, which is a series of essays from people in and around the comic book industry talking about Jack Kirby. But specifically, what I thought was really interesting about the book is you have mini essays detailing specific runs and periods, it's quite an interesting look at books that you may not have thought of when you think of Jack. So this was a lot of fun to talk to Jim about how he kind of curated this and put this together. You got 28 different writers tackling 28 topics in this particular book. We also talk about Jim's recent decision to stop buying monthly comics after, I think he says, 55 years. So we actually talk about that for, I think, 20 minutes. But I thought that was so interesting, and he had been posting about this extensively on his Facebook. So I thought I'd take the time on the podcast to talk about what that journey means. I think it is interesting for a lot of us. You know, we go, you know, some of us are more collectors, some of us are more readers, some people kind of are in the middle of both, and they get into the Wednesday Warrior habit. So it's interesting to talk to him about what the evolution of that was for him and how he kind of makes that decision and what his thoughts are. But the fact is, he unabashedly loves comics, and that comes through in every moment of this interview. Just because he's not going to be buying monthly comics anymore does not mean that he has in any way diminished his love of the medium. So this is quite a fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and you can also listen to us on Spotify and many other podcasting apps. By the looks of it, we're everywhere. So thanks so much for listening to this episode. The next episode is going to be a conversation with Judd Winnick, specifically talking about his Green Arrow run from the mid-2000s, which was a lot of fun to have. Great conversation. So that'll be the next episode that'll be coming out next week on August the 9th. Thanks again for listening to this episode and to this podcast, and let's jump right into the conversation with Jim Beard. Enjoy. Jim, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast today. How are you?
Hey, good. Thank you very much. You know, something occurred to me, and I've been waiting to tell you this. When we were first talking about me coming on your show, you mentioned to me that you were in France at that time.
That's right.
And I said, how perfect that we were talking about Jack Kirby, a man who, during World War II, was in the infantry in France.
That's right.
And I just thought that was kind of perfect. And it gets better for me that he was actually in a pretty big battle that took place in the Lorraine Valley in France. And my dad's people are actually from that part of France. There's Alsace-Lorraine is kind of in between France and Germany. It has both a German and a French name, so that Lorraine area. Who knows? Jack may have actually been protecting family members of mine, relatives of mine, during World War II. So how cool is that?
That's very cool. Wow. So he'd be a hero to your family, and not just a literary hero. He's
definitely a hero to me. That's for sure.
So usually I would start off with what I think is pretty typical. I'd ask you about, your first kind of experience with comics. But instead of asking you that first, I thought I would ask you about something that you've been posting about in social media that I'm very curious about. And I think a lot of people end up coming to this type of realization. You've recently started giving away or getting rid of a large part of your comic book collection in the last decade or so of stuff, and kind of made the decision not to buy kind of ongoing new comics. So I'm very curious, what led you to that decision, and was it difficult, and is it easy to cut the cord?
it wasn't. It was a long time coming. Just so everybody knows, I'm getting rid of no Jack Kirby comic books. Those are all staying. So I have been getting new / current comics for about 55 years now. And it's been one heck of a ride. The thing that changed for me that finally brought me to this decision, and I've hit this, kind of pivot point for many times over in the past several years, but I just turned 60. And I realized that I wanted to try to create more memories with going places and doing things rather than collecting more stuff. And I started going through all of my comics that I have gotten since about the time of DC's New 52. And those were just kind of all over the place. I had done very little organization over those years, and I wanted to start putting those together, series with series, alphabetizing, and something was really reinforced in my mind, which was that I barely remembered none of the storylines really stuck out very much to me. And I struggled with, remembering, why did I pick this up? Why was I following that series? Oh my God, I did, the Dark Avengers series, or I did the Frankenstein and whatever that was, the New 52 book that was out for a little while with Frankenstein, and I can't remember what the part was. But so that really helped. Now, we're recording this on a Monday. This Wednesday will be the very first Wednesday that I will not be buying new comics. Yeah, I actually had to tell my comic shop guy last Wednesday that what I was buying from him that day was going to be it. That was a really tough thing, really, really hard thing to do. And you would have seen me say this. The bottom line is, I still love comic books. I will still always buy comic books. I will still always talk about comics. I will still always write about comics. I will still have comics as part of my life. It's just, going forward, I'm not going to invest in, in that weekly read of the current stuff. I'm going to keep myself steeped in comics history, more than anything. I'm going to try to keep up on what's going on. I'll probably still get the DC and Marvel's monthly catalogs, and just kind of glance at them and kind of, have an idea of what's going on. And it's not to say I will never, ever buy another new, or current comic. But that's it, kind of in a nutshell. We'll see. We'll see how this goes. Maybe I'm going to cry every Wednesday morning. I don't know, but I don't think so.
I'm curious, making a decision like that is obviously a big one, but what did you find, you were still buying currently? Were you devoted to specific titles, or were you kind of sampling based on creators? I guess that's part of what would probably make it harder to make a cut, right? If you've been buying, I've been buying I haven't been reading comic books that long in comparison with your 55 years, but I've been buying Amazing Spider-Man since issue 419, which is still pretty late, but it's still in the 900s now. So if I was to try and break that, it would probably be a little bit hard because it's a consistent run. It's probably the only consistent run I still have. So I'm curious what we were still buying, and then was it harder for some of those titles to say goodbye than others?
I always had a few core title things that I always got, and then other ones were, I would say I want to try this or I want to try that. That looks really good. Maybe I would follow a creator. If Grant Morrison was going to come out with something new, I was absolutely going to be right there and try that. But the one thing that I have followed pretty much consistently over those 55 years is Batman. Batman is my most favorite fictional character of all time. I have, and I say usually or normally, followed him through thick or thin. There was one writer who who put a gap in my Batman collection, and I won't shame him, on this, but there was one person that I got to the point where I just hated what he was doing so much that I actually stopped and waited until he was off the title, and then went back again. But that's going to be the hard one right there, to not be following what is happening to Batman. And that's not to say there hasn't been some good stuff recently. I just stopped in the middle of two storylines for the most part. What was going on in the Batman title, what was going on in the Detective Comics title, and the Batman and Robin one. That was still in the middle of the story. But those particular stories, I found that I look back and I said, I'm not even really, up on, or feel like I know or remember from week to, month to month, what's going on in some of those storylines. But it's never been the same since Grant Morrison was writing it. I absolutely loved what Grant was doing back before the New 52. And in fact, he was one of the only creators that was allowed to finish out what he was doing, though the New 52 had begun. He was still writing Batman Incorporated, and he had not yet finished that storyline, and they allowed him to. Batman kind of continues unabated after New 52, after that big change. But yeah, I was following the Superman titles. I was following Justice League Unlimited, and that's a little bit of a shame. Mark Waid was suddenly writing half of DC's line, and I love, Mark's take on things. Over at Marvel, I've been following Avengers for quite a while now. I go back and forth with Amazing Spider-Man, but I was on a fairly long run with it. But that just started over with number one, and as an older guy, that always just kind of bugged me. I've never cared what number is on the outside of a book. That they don't do that for me. I'm not their audience. When they do stuff like that. And other than that stuff, it's just been kind of, whatever kind of strikes my fancy. Every once in a while, I may say, you know what, I'm going to give Iron Man a try again. I haven't read Flash in a long time. I might say, Green Lantern. I'm going to try Green Lantern again, But those are easier to give up. The Batman books are going to be the hard ones. Check back in with me next week and the week after that, and the week after that, and you'll see me on street corners, begging people to tell me what's going on in Batman right now. Who's writing Detective Comics at the moment?
I'm really curious about that, because it's interesting. It sounds like you kind of came to a bargaining decision with yourself that you're either going to go cold turkey or not, because it'd be easy to say, well, just till the end of the story, just till the end of the storyline. And I guess that becomes the slippery slope of how do you stop? You wait till this person's run is over, but then you're not really giving it up. So it sounds like you kind of made this decision. If I'm going to do this, I have to do this.
Yeah, and you hit on it absolutely. The language and word choice and everything. That's all exactly what it was. I know myself well enough by this point that if I do start negotiating with myself, that it's that slippery slope, like you said. I knew I had to hit that week and go, this today. Tomorrow's the day. I'm walking into that shop. I'm going to buy what they were, holding there for me, and then say, I'm out. And I've been going to the same shop since 1984. Wow. That was not easy. The owner of the shop that I go to is a good, dear friend of mine. And I told him, I said, it's not like I'm not going to come in. I may pop in every few weeks. I'm going to look through the back issue boxes and see, what you got in. I might buy a collection now and then. I might buy one of those new facsimiles that they're doing, that we seem to be in this weird facsimile obsession from both, from the big two at the moment, but they're also, doing facsimiles of stuff that I could never afford to buy, and do another issue of more fun comics. I'll buy it. I'll plop down $4 or $5 for it. Not a problem. So I want to retain, that connection, and that's going to help a lot. But no, I did. I sat there and I said, just buy Batman and Detective. And then it was just buy Batman. And then I said, no, I know how I am. That will not work. I need to go cold turkey or not at all. And I did it. It wasn't easy, but I did it. But I'm never going to be one of those guys that's going to knock the comics industry. It's not working the same way it used to for me, week to week, month to month, year to year, and it was the time. It was finally the time, and turning 60 really helped.
It's interesting you mentioned the idea of at times a collection here and there. Is that a slippery slope for you too, or is that easier for you to kind of put a stop to because it's not the same as the monthly periodicals? Like, is there something about? You mentioned that you mentioned that maybe you might get a collection or two here and there.
Oh, yeah, collected work. No, I don't think so, because I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to tend to be something older. I mean, I don't think I'm going to buy the next few Batman collections of stories that were just finished, a couple months before that or whatever. I don't think that I'm going to do that, because that's kind of a slippery slope. If I had 5 friends say, "Oh my God, that one storyline that they finished a few months ago was just everything," I might take a look at it, and maybe I might allow myself that. No, I can see myself, buying, something that was collected from 1970s comics, 60s, 40s, 50s, whatever, like that. Or, I just recently bought the, DC did a really nice collection of the Super Pets stories. There's Crypto and Streaky and Beppo and Bat Hound, that's the kind of thing that I'll really enjoy picking up from time to time. For a Jack Kirby collection.
Yeah, so I should actually ask you about your book. Now,
no, I segued for you.
After we've done this therapy session about giving up comics.
Thank you. It's funny. No one has really asked me in depth, so I get to if anybody is still listening at this point, if they don't go, God, this guest of yours, is a jerk. Like, he doesn't like comics at all. He hates them. How could he quit?
You know what? I
still listening.
I find it so interesting because, I'm obviously I'm a younger person because I'm about 41, but I went through.
Yeah, don't rub it in, buddy.
But I remember about 10 years ago, I was I don't think I have space anymore. So I had to start shifting and reading a lot of things digitally. And then there were still some books I would buy in singles. But then I realized at some point, kind of to your point about it can become slippery slope with collections, I found that I was buying a lot of older legacy material. I was more interested in buying that. I was buying Marvel stuff from 70s, 80s, and 90s. I found it more interesting and more felt like something I would go back to. It was interesting, stuff I remember loving in the 2000s. I'm I loved this at the time. I have no interest in reading this again. But then you hand me something from the 70s or 80s, and I'm I've read this before, but I can't wait to read this again. And I couldn't figure out what it was. I think one thing I've talked about on the show a lot in the past, and I'm sure people are tired of me hearing about it, but I really love the old coloring processes. I know we can do so much more things with digital coloring, but I think there's just something about the original kind of 4-color process and the way that they had to make certain coloring choices. Those books pop for me. They're warmer in a way that they make me want to read them more and go back to them in a way that more modern comics don't have that same sense of physical or visual allure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a fan of paper that I don't have to keep shifting so that the light doesn't glare off of it. I absolutely hate that. the old style coloring is certainly something that I like, except for when they get it wrong. You know, and when they cut the mats or whatever they had to do back then to do it, and they, you know, there's an infamous cover, infamous to me. My very first issue of World's Finest that my dad ever bought me has one of Batman's boots miscolored green on the cover. Like, how did that get past everybody? And I love that issue, and I love that book and the whole thing in that era. But boy, to this day, does that just bug the crap out of me that that's wrong. You know, on there. I did spend time separating out, you know, everything from New 52 on and whatever would be the equivalent era with Marvel. Obviously, there's not a dividing line there. And went through it all and told myself, pull out anything that you know that you would want to reread that will be a perennial with you, and that's okay. And honestly, I have this little teeny tiny stack. I mean, that was another thing that really cemented it for me. There was, I was like, oh, you know, I remember I did like Dark Avengers for that matter since I brought it up. But honestly, I had no real desire to reread it. You know, I mean, I had good fond memories of it, but it wasn't one of the ones. It wasn't like, you know, Batman R.I.P., you know, going back to Grant Morrison again. I know I will want to reread that story, the Black Glove story, you know, all of that. I know that I will want to reread that. I will want to reread Avengers: The Children's Crusade storyline, you know, again. I want to reread Kurt Busiek and George Perez's Avengers run together, you know, that, and then behind that, Roger Stern's run. So I am actually, someone's going to be in the next week or so getting from me about 2,400 comics. It's like 13 short boxes or something like that. My estimation is that it's about 2,400 comics, you know. And I'm getting pennies on the dollar for them. But you know what? It's not about that, you know. It's like I want something for them, but just, you know, take them, you know, go through them, resell them, do whatever you want. They're all mint. I read them once, and then they went into a stack. You know, and that's just really sad. I think that the sooner that they're out of my house, the better. And I won't miss those. You know, I'll remember. I remember the stuff out of those years that, you know, that I liked, which wasn't a ton.
It's funny you mentioned Dark Avengers because that's the example I have in my head. I actually ordered like the Modern Era Epic, and I had it come, and I'm like, I'm not going to read this. I'm going to bring it back. Like I flipped through it, and I was like, I had tremendous memories. I loved reading that book at the time, and it felt like it was a moment in time. That moment has passed, and I'm not the right reader for this anymore. And I had to just realize that that's where I was at. So it's funny you mentioned Dark Avengers because that was for me kind of that big crystallizing moments where I'm like, I'm not going to read this anymore. Just sad.
And yet, I will reread Avengers Mansion Under Siege. You know, that storyline with Roger Stern and John Buscema and Tom Palmer inking. I'll read that over and those issues over and over and over again because I just absolutely love that. But yeah, not a lot of stuff after that stacks up to that. Not a reread. Not like Jack Kirby.
Speaking of Jack Kirby,
Speaking of Jack Kirby,
I have to give props where props are due. So I actually first even heard about this book in when reading Tom Brevoort's newsletter because he was mentioning that he had written a text piece in it. So that helped me.
May I just say how amazing it is to have a book about Jack Kirby with an essay by a sitting editor, a senior editor at Marvel. Like Tom Brevoort, this is not the first time that he's written an essay in one of my nonfiction books, and I'm just so blessed, you know, to have him in there, and he's talking about one of the Fourth World books too,
right?
You know, which is just really Forever People, which is really just amazing to me that that's the one that he wanted, and I said, go for it.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think of Tom Brevoort, I think of Fantastic Four, because I think anyone who reads any of his writings, his newsletters, etc., knows he's a huge FF fan. So I just kind of assumed when he first mentioned him, I was like, oh, that's not what I would have expected. So I was very curious about that. It was interesting having him, as you say, like he's so branded by Marvel, and having him talk about the King working on DC was really quite something.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise for me. It made me wonder if he had to ask his bosses at Marvel if he was allowed to write about a DC property, But that's the kind of thing that I want to do in my books. I want people to go, oh my God, he's got Tom Brevoort in here, and look what he's writing about. Like, I have to read that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, big Marvel guy, but at the end of the day, he's a big Kirby guy, and I think that's what's really important, that he can see the joy of Jack in no matter what it is, no matter what company, no matter what era Jack was working in. And I think that's really cool, and that's one of those little nice, pleasant surprises that I hope people will discover when they pick up Jack of All Comics.
It's interesting, one of the first essays by Cliff Biggers, who talks about, FF, one thing that immediately struck me, and I don't think it would strike anyone else, but it's only because I've interviewed a lot of comic creators over the years, is that he kind of intros that one of the first times he really got to know comics is when he's recovering in a hospital from a tonsillectomy. And that seems like a very weird shared history for a lot of people who started reading comics in the 50s and 60s, that they were in the hospital or they were homesick, and then their family member brought them comics, and then they hooked them. So I'm curious, how many times have you heard that story, or some variation of that?
Well, it's kind of my own story, too, and that's another thing that I hope people will find when they read one of my nonfiction anthologies like this, is that they will see themselves in some of the essays. And then the flip side of that coin is, or get a glimpse of somebody's life that is completely different from theirs, too. That can be fascinating, and the other part can be comforting, too. I love that part of Cliff's essay, because I saw myself in that. When my brother and sister and I, when we were sick, we got the flu once a year, it was just inevitable. And we got to camp out on the living room couch that became like the throne, and you were royalty for those couple of days that you were sick, and everybody waited on your hand and foot. My dad would do that. He would come home from work, and he'd bring me some comics, or he'd bring me a book, and the book was usually something pop culture-y, fun, dinosaurs, or going to the moon, or whatever. But I love that. Cliff is, he's about, I hate to say, I hope he's not listening to this, he's roughly 10 years older than me, if I remember correctly. So it was a glimpse into a kid who was a lot like me, but a little bit, earlier. Mm-hmm. And God, am I envious of him to see those early Fantastic Fours when they were new. I mean, that's hard for me to wrap my brain around, but Cliff brought it to life. And I just love that about his essay.
When it's interesting reading through, and obviously you were very clear in your own essay that you were going to talk about first issue special, and no one was going to get in your way, and I don't think anyone was trying to, right? But
nobody was asked for it.
It's interesting. This is Jack Kirby is obviously a very big topic, and there's so many different avenues you can go in. So I'm curious how you kind of decided how you were going to structure this type of book. And it's an interesting decision as well to start with the 60s, not really do a lot kind of pre-60s, we can kind of move from 60s forward. And obviously that would have been a conscious decision. I'm wondering how you kind of settled on that idea for the narrative, or lack thereof, I guess, the structure of the essays, I should say. Yeah,
in some ways there is a formula that I have. I know the length of these books that I want to do. Mm-hmm. They have to be at least 60,000 words, in my opinion. When I write a novel, I always aim for 60,000 words. In my little corner of the world, that's called a novel. It's novel length, like they used to say in the comics. it really worked out great because I knew that I wanted to cover those three eras where Jack hit the biggest popularity of all, and that would be Marvel Comics 1.0, DC Comics 1.0, and then Marvel Comics 2.0 when he comes back. It's a fascinating cycle that happens to him, and it's not always the most joyous of stories. Mm-hmm. But I knew that that's what I wanted to cover, and you can't not start with 1961 and FF #1. Sure, he was producing a lot of work with Atlas, in the 50s, and then heading into the 60s, he was doing a lot of work. But then there's the seismic charge of FF #1. I started counting the series that he worked on. I knew I wanted at least 25 essays in the book, and I had an idea of a length, an average length, and that worked out mathematically to me that was going to create a full book. It was going to be a book, that worthy of the price tag I was going to put on it, worthy of the subject matter, and I couldn't believe it. It worked out to exactly 25 essays that I wanted to do. And yes, there was a couple things where I had to say, well, that's not really going to fit in, but that's okay. Mm-hmm. Weirdly enough, the book came out to be 28 essays, and that was because a couple things. One of the things was that Paul Kupperberg, we were writing about an icon, Jack Kirby. Paul Kupperberg is an iconoclast. He has to knock down, everything, his own thing, which is fine because I always get something great out of him when he does it. He said, hey, I don't want any of those choices that you're giving us, all these writers. I want to write about the two black and white magazines that Jack did when he was at DC that people don't really talk about, Spirit World and In the Days of the Mob. And I'm like, when Paul Kupperberg says that that's what he wants to write about, mm-hmm. Started to expand a little bit. Kind of towards the end of the writing, I decided that I didn't want to skip over Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. I said, you know what? No, I'm going to get called on the carpet if that's not in there. So, especially since there's a Captain America appearance during that, and Nick Fury becomes such an important character, one that Jack actually goes back to in Strange Tales when he brings Fury into the modern era and with S.H.I.E.L.D. So it worked out great. I don't stop at 60,000 words. It just has to be at least that. The book got a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and I said, that's okay, because you just said it yourself. Jack is a big subject. He's the king, and he deserves as big of a book as it's going to come out to be. It doesn't matter after we hit that one threshold. And that's literally, how the parameters came about. And from there, it was literally just to start plugging in writers.
Mm-hmm. One thing I really appreciated about it and is that because of the various different voices that you have contributing, not everyone was a Kirby fan from the beginning. Now I'm forgetting his name, but there was an essay by someone who's like, I didn't really fall in love with him till later, till I think it was New Gods that they read in 2012. I forget it now. I'm forgetting who wrote that one.
Michael Bailey. Yeah.
Yes. So I really liked that different approach that, you had someone who really appreciates the genius of Kirby now, but maybe didn't always, and kind of talks about their own reckoning with what they thought about that. And it wasn't until they kind of had a quote-unquote come to Jesus moment where they kind of were able to sit down and read something and really have their eyes open towards it. And I like that it wasn't just people who were instantly like Kirby right from the beginning that they were huge fans, but some had to kind of come to it or realize, or maybe they didn't appreciate it till later. And I thought that gave the book a wider depth.
Yeah, I totally agree. There was two different writers who basically took the stance of how I learned to stop worrying and love Jack Kirby, paraphrasing from the Dr. Strangelove thing. And that was okay with me because my opinion is it doesn't matter how you come to Jack Kirby as long as you get there. Mm-hmm. And then it's undeniable that influence. In my introduction, I talk about that I've known people throughout the years who love Jack Kirby's work, and I've known people who hate Jack Kirby's work. Now, I can't, that's hard for me to get into that mindset, because my argument has always been, you can hate the work, but you cannot deny the influence that he had and the place that he has in history. You may not like those big blocky fists. Some people say bricks for knees, in his anatomy. You may not like that. You may not like that a lot of his characters look exactly alike. All of the women look exactly alike. But you cannot deny his place in comics history and his influence on the industry. I mean, my God, the guy pretty much created or co-created entire genres of comic books. I mean, he and Joe Simon created the romance comic, which used to be a staple of the industry. That's just amazing. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and I look for that, and then I also love when it sort of happens on its own, where somebody says, and I told everybody it's we're celebrating Jack, but it doesn't have to be a love fest either. I get it. I'm critical of things that he did too. He wasn't the greatest scripter in the world. Plot, maybe, ideas is just off the charts. Sometimes his dialogue, but it's so Jack, which is what I really love about it. But that's okay, and I think you hit right upon it again, too, by saying, it makes for a nice, varied narrative throughout this book.
Reading it and seeing, as you kind of break it out and you're kind of saying, which issues, which years, it really does help to drive home the idea of just the mountain of output. And again, we're in a time and era where comic book artists can't do 12 issues a year. It's different, and the expectations of the consumer is different as well. So the art has had to become a little bit more detailed, etc. But in general, you do not get, typically, unless you're Dan Mora, you don't usually get 12 issues a year. If there's a few guys who are outliers, like Mark Bagley was one who was always a workhorse and really could develop 18 issues a year, but most people couldn't. And then you look at the crazy volume of output that Jack Kirby was cranking out during this period and coming up with all these concepts. It's one thing to be generating the work, but as you said, generating the ideas to go with the work is really something else. And so seeing it so condensed like this and seeing all the different things that was all happening at the same time, it really underscores just that's why he's the king. The volume and the output is just incredible and unmatched. Yeah,
Jack had things going on in his life, and at the time when he was really becoming who he was, that informed that work ethic. And and I'm not dissing the guys now, the men and women now, but Jack had a wife and kids and a mortgage, and he had always said, I worked because I needed food on the table, a roof over our heads, my wife to be happy, my kids to be happy, that they could go to school and have braces and all of that thing. So, he came up in an era where the more work that you did, the more you got paid. And in an era where, you didn't get paid very well. That took a long while. It's amazing. He was doing 4 Fourth World books at the same time. Can you ask somebody to do that today? No. Jimmy Olsen, Forever People, New Gods, and Mr. Miracle, month after month after month. And then don't get me started on his, the peak of the Marvel era and how much he was doing. And it's funny is a lot of that is also Stan, who insisted that everything that they put out looked like either Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko. Telling artists that's okay, but I want you to look more like Jack. Do it here, Jack. Do the layouts for this guy here. So it's like, no problem, Stan. I'm already drawing 5. Penciling fully 5 books. I'll do the layout on 3 more. Sure. But again, that was in an era where you built a work ethic because you needed and work you did if you wanted to, survive.
I was at a convention many years ago, and Mark Bagley was talking about his work ethic, and he was saying that when he came before he entered the comic industry, he wasn't drawing. He was a roofer. Like, he had a job, and he had to it's just like you said about Jack having to provide for a family. And so when he got this opportunity, he was like, I may not be the best artist, but damn if anyone's going to work harder than me. And so he but he had a quote unquote real job, and he knew how hard it was out there, and he wanted to make a go at this. And he's like, well, I'm going to work super hard. So it feels like he's kind of like the modern Jack Kirby in that particular way, in terms of employing a very strong work ethic.
Very, very much so. I will totally agree with you on that. That's wonderful. And there really hasn't been very many artists over the years that we could say, are the new Jack Kirby or the current Jack Kirby. And that's not saying that it's matched in the art. There have been a few guys over the years who have, the art is somewhat like Jack Kirby. He used to be a really popular guy, but he was only popular for this tiny little bit of time. He worked for Marvel, and he was almost a clone of Jack Kirby. And he went by a single name. Do you remember this guy? He was drawing one of the X books. Shoot, I can't think of what it is. Sorry about that. But yeah, there've been a couple of those guys. But as far as work ethic goes, yeah, I totally agree with you about Mark.
Were you thinking of Ladron?
Ladron, yeah.
Yeah,
whatever happened to him?
I don't know. It's interesting. I remember picking up his Cable in the late 90s, early 2000s.
That's it.
Yeah, and it had a very Jack Kirby style, and it felt...
Oh, he was doing a total Jack Kirby, yeah.
And I appreciate it, I think, more now, but I know at the time it definitely stood out. I'll say that, because it felt so different than what anyone else was doing. But yeah, definitely kind of channeling that style. I don't know whatever happened to Ladron.
Yeah. It might have been a personal thing on his account, or it may be that, people just realize, I guess, all you're doing is just Jack Kirby again, and that can, the buzz off of that is only going to last for, a little while. But yeah, I remember that and kind of always wondered what happened to him. Thank you for thinking of that name. I would never have dredged that up without doing a search. Googling it.
A question I have. So one of the things I think it came up in maybe two of the essays, I know for sure at least one, the idea that when Jack is working at DC and whenever Superman kind of shows up, they're kind of redoing the face, right, to kind of keep it on model. I'm curious what your stance is on the idea of kind of having quote unquote on model characters. I say that mainly because in the last 20 years, it feels like from the big two, they've gone, there's no such thing as an on model as much anymore for a lot of these characters. Like if you look at Peter Parker these days, half the time you wouldn't necessarily know who it is because everyone has their own style. How do you feel about the idea of having kind of a house model style, and how do you feel about what that meant for Jack?
It's an archaic idea that maybe a lot of people today wouldn't really understand what it's about. While I don't like that they did it, I do understand it from their perspective at that time in comics history, why they would want to do that thing. It seems outrageous that you're going to alter Jack's art, From what I understand, Jack was the kind of guy that he had that forward momentum, and yeah, there were these little heartaches along the line, and honestly, the story of him at DC Comics is pretty much one of heartache, that he had, and disappointment with almost everything he did there. But again, I do understand why they would want that. Today, you don't have it because, in my opinion, the way artists or creators in general are treated is so different from 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s somewhat, where they're treated as more or less superstars now. And maybe that's not so hard to understand because it would have had to come to a time where the industry started to realize how they were treating these people who are the backbone of the industry. But I think it's gotten so far now opposite of what it was. You know, it once was that these guys, you come in, you pick up your assignment, I better have it back in a week, and then maybe I'll give you another one. You know, it was the editors who were the more or less the superstars of it and running the show. Now, and pardon my French, you know, now we kiss the asses of, you know, all of the writers and, you know, deservedly so for most times or whatever. But you know what? But then that's why we also don't have, sometimes we barely have a schedule anymore with comics. That's why so much stuff doesn't come out on time. You know, that's why sometimes a 12-issue miniseries that should have been out in 1 year's time comes out in 2 years' time. You know, because they're not going to tell these guys, hey, we're paying you, you need to hand your work in on time or we're going to get rid of you. You know, there's too much of a more or less, you know, cult following for so many, you know, writers and artists. Jack was popular in his day and maybe more or less a superstar, but if only he was working now, you know, he would have probably been more fulfilled than he ever was back in the day, you know. And yeah, there were times where he was not treated well, and that's a whole nother, you know, line of conversation. But going back to the thing about the changing of the heads, I can't fault them for wanting to do that. It is unfortunate that it happens to be Jack is the guy that we talk about. You know, it happened to other, you know, guys too. The weird thing is that Jack was hired by DC, Carmine Infantino, to be Jack Kirby, but once he was there, he was not really always allowed to be Jack Kirby. Like, if you're going to hire Kirby, you want him to be that guy, you know. Paul Kupperberg has an amazing theory about that, and he's, you know, very sure of this, is that DC didn't really care what Jack did once he got over there. All they wanted was that he was not at Marvel. That's all that mattered to Carmine and to DC. Otherwise, Jack, whatever, you know, your funny little, you know, stuff, and then, you know, we cancel it after a year, you know, 9 issues and whatever, you know, it's, you know, and then he went on to the next thing. I think overall those changing faces when you have Al Plastino or Murphy draw those heads, I think that probably ended up just being a little blip on his radar. You know, there were bigger battles to fight and to worry about DC needing to have a house style. And now today we've gotten glimpses of the photo stats of the pencil work. You know, we can see what it looks like. I love this. There was once, DC Direct once did a line of action figures, Fourth World action figures, and there was 2 series, and in I think it's the second series, they did a Superman figure, except the head is not an Al Plastino head or a Murphy Anderson head. It's literally a Jack Kirby Superman head. So, you know, in some ways, you know, Jack has gotten justice on that topic many years later.
From obviously there's so much in the Kirby oeuvre. Besides obviously first issue comics, what was some of the things that you were most excited to read? What other people were going to write about? Like, did you find was the most exciting of when you were kind of doling out all the topics and kind of looking through all the different things he had worked on? Which one were you most excited to read someone else's take on?
If Charles Rutledge had not done the essay on Jimmy Olsen, Superman's pal, I would have written that one myself. I was very excited for Charles to hand that in because he may actually match me on my love for what Jack did on that book. That is, it's definitely my favorite DC book of his. Whether or not it matches Fantastic Four, that'd be hard to say. But and you know what I'm going to tell you? I was actually really excited to see the essays come in for the books that I'm not that familiar with. I hate to say this, but I'm not so sure if I've read any of the losers' stories in Our Fighting Forces. It's a book that's not really on the radar a lot, and it's weird because it actually turns out to be one of Jack's most personal works because he's basically telling stories of things that he saw right up close, in World War II. That was really nice. I was really surprised that Brian Morris actually asked for that because I feel like I know Brian pretty well. And when he said, he came back and he's like, I want to do Our Fighting Forces and those loser stories. And I was like what? Okay, I'm certainly not going to argue with you. We already talked about Tom Brevoort, choosing Forever People. Paul Kupperberg demanding to do Spirit World and in the Days of the Mob. Those are the ones that really, stick out to me. It's no surprise to have Van Plexico on the Avengers because he is literally Mr. Avengers. He's done books about the Avengers and the website and all of that, so no surprise there. And I don't think it was a whole big surprise that Cliff Biggers absolutely wanted the Fantastic Four, and probably he is the guy who should have written that and did, end up writing that. Those are the ones that I think that really, really stick out to me that I was most excited for. Everybody pretty much got their first or second choices. I gathered together the writers. I think only one person turned down the project. And I love it because they admitted they just weren't that much of a Kirby person, and that was really, nice to get that honesty from them. Everybody then gave me three choices in order, of first choice, second choice, third choice, and then I started plugging those in. And I'm really proud to say I don't think I had to go to a third choice for anybody. Pretty much everybody, a lot of people got their first choices, and the rest of them got their second choices.
I'm going to ask you kind of a weird existential question, but what do you think someone's favorite Kirby story or title that he worked on says about them as a comic fan or reader? It's interesting because obviously as you go through the different essays, in some cases it's because it hit them at a certain time, or occupied a place in their life when they were a specific reader. But past that, what do you think of what some of these runs or some of these issues really say about the person who identifies with them the most? What is it about those Kirbys?
Number one, they all have very good taste, obviously. But you just said it. I think a lot of it is that it says something about their formative years. Most everybody came to Kirby as a kid, and were in one way or another blown away by what they were seeing. When they got one of those 2-page splashes, or for the first time they saw those weird collages that he used to do. Even today, those things are still so weird to me. But I think it says something about Jack really appealed to children. When you hear a lot of people say they hate Jack Kirby, I think they're speaking as adults. It makes me wonder if they had seen Jack as young kids, and if they hadn't, would things have been different? I can actually see some younger people today, maybe some 20-somethings, 30-somethings, who if they were shown Jack's work for the first time, they may go, like, what is this? And not in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not in like, oh, I love how bonkers it is, but literally they, you know, because today we've said it, there's nothing like him at all. I think it says something to their character in terms of they want comic books to be comic books, and Jack is the quintessential comic book creator. They want and love energy in their comic stories. It's been said that Jack was as wonderful doing a scene of people sitting around the breakfast table as he was with a slugfest in the streets of, you know, New York with buildings falling on top of people, you know, or somebody riding a surfboard, you know, in outer space. That's true, but it's really all about energy, I think. If you boil Kirby down, you get that Kirby crackle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get those funny little circles that represent Jack's energy on the page. I think that the people who are drawn to him love that kinetic, you know, dynamism in his work and those wonderful concepts. Forget necessarily the plots or the dialogue and sometimes even the characters, but those wonderful, wonderful concepts. At the end of the day, Jack was an idea man, and that's what I think I love about him the most.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to that point. Now I'm forgetting which one it is, so my apologies. But one of the essays talking about all the different technologies that Jack had to come up with when he was developing S.H.I.E.L.D.
That's Bob Greenberger, another veteran of the comics industry. Yeah, all of that wonderful stuff.
And we take it for granted now because it's just part of. You know, it's interesting because as he's describing it, just in the first few pages, you're like, "Yep, that's all what we've always seen." Any S.H.I.E.L.D. story involves all those things, and yet he just throws it out in the first few pages and develops this framework, this this visual language for what we know of an entire subsection of the Marvel Universe, and he just develops it in a few pages.
I think that there's a knee-jerk reaction that all Jack ever had in his stories were impossible machines. And yeah, there is a lot of that. I'm laughing right now because I just visualized Reed Richards' device that was basically just a coffee maker, you know, but it's one of those ones with the twisting tubes and this and that, you know, a true Kirby machine. And then, you know, I think Ben Grimm even says like all that and all it does is make coffee, you know, and I love that. But what people don't realize, and they're going to learn and get it pointed out to them in Bob's essay is those sort of telling the future, you know, of what was coming. And then going back to those Our Fighting Forces stories, Jack had little sidebar things that showed all of the equipment and everything. He did actually love real world nuts and bolts, you know, the tanks, the jeeps, the guns, you know, and all of that stuff, and kind of showed all of that. So, you know, as much as he dreamed of just, you know, things that the ultimate nullifier, like what the hell is that? You know, we don't have anything even like that. You know, he was also a nuts and bolts guy, and did have some grounded, you know, sensibilities too, which is another thing that I love about him. You know, one half of his head in space, and the other, you know, right down here on Earth in the nitty gritty.
In a lot of ways, like, given how you talk about Kirby, it's almost interesting that it took you this long to have done this book about Kirby. How long was this kind of gestating within kind of your mind as something that you wanted to do? Obviously, you've worked on so many different things, have so many different books, and obviously Batman's been a particular focus. So what is it about finally now was the time for Kirby?
Yeah, thanks a lot, True Believer. Thanks for shaming me for taking so long to do this book. Adam, this book, it really was years in the making. I've been wanting to do this one for years. I have done more nonfiction books with my publishing house, Becky Books, than I have done fiction. And I've had a lot of ideas of what I wanted to do with nonfiction books, but this one has always been on my list, has always been in the back of my mind. And I think it was because I got a lot of other ones out of the way, and I thought maybe this is the time that I could focus on it. It's almost like the decision to stop buying modern comics. You know, it took me a while to say, now is the time is right. Jack's been gone for a while now, and there have been a lot of books about him, and there's going to be a lot more about him. I wanted to do it right. I did not want it to get lost in the shuffle of books about Jack. I wanted it to be unique, and I think that is what we've created. A lot of what we have is about his own life, and his mindset, his outlook, and things like that. But what we get is it's almost always from a single perspective. It's a single writer. It's a single set of opinions. I wanted more than that, and the subtitle says it. I wanted a conversation. I didn't want it to be just me talking about Jack. And, when you get down to, like, the 12th series that he did, and Jim's pretty much saying the same thing again, and he's going to go back to that story about how we first saw Jack Kirby's work, I wanted a selection of writers from different eras, people who were older than me, people who were younger than me, people who came into it as kids, came into it later after they were an adult. There's a couple of guys, who didn't even like it to begin with, and it took a little up already. So, I don't know. It was just one of those things where everything came together, that it was the right time. And this one actually took a little longer to put together. And that's okay, because I really wanted everybody to give this 200% instead of 150%. It had to be just right. On the back cover of the book, it says there are a million ways to talk about Jack Kirby, and that's true. And we're getting to that point where there's almost a million books about him. But this is going to be and is 28 different ways of talking about Jack. Here's 28 out of a million, and it's 28 different voices. You are never going to get the same thing twice in these essays, because it is a different person each time, and they all, as Superman says at the beginning of the JLU, animated show, you all bring something different to the table. And that's what it is we're all talking about this one guy, but everybody brings something different to the table in their essays.
It's interesting. I mean, the idea of that, telling a story about Jack, but doing it differently, because you're basically filtering it through the work. Like, you're using the work at particular junctures of his career to then channel what's that saying about Jack, which is a different interpretation of how to do a story about Jack. Because you're right, if it's just a kind of a bland, more, general history of the man, it's going to go from project to project to project, but it's not going to say, what does that project then say about the artist, about the creator? And being able to zero in on it the way that you guys did, you're able to take each facet and each run he did and say, well, this is how it's showing different parts of Jack and how Jack matters through that particular book. And I thought that was a nice lens to take. And as you say, like, there's books in here that people don't often talk about, and it's interesting to see what does the work say about the creator, especially the ones, as you said, like the more the latter year kind of war books. What does that say about him telling a more personal story that might have been overlooked by others?
Yeah, that was important to me. And God love all of the people who have done books about Jack, but inevitably they're going to kind of speed past some of the series that he worked on, and I think that's a shame. A good example is Sandman. He did that Sandman title. He was reunited with Joe Simon. on that. Sandman #1 is one of my most favorite single issues of any Jack Kirby comic. I absolutely love what those guys did in that. But I didn't want to just go, oh yeah, and then he did Sandman, Our Fighting Forces, and one single issue of Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter, and then go on to, and then he jumped back to Marvel, and then, have a whole chapter on Eternals or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want that because I want some of this other stuff to be remembered, but also to talk about the true impact it has on readers. Other books may talk about how he did Sandman or how he did OMAC,
mm-hmm.
but what was its impact outside of that and on people, kids? What was the impact on kids? Reading about it, I didn't want to gloss over that. And I want people to be surprised, like, oh my God, he has an entire essay about Sandman? And you know what? That's one of my favorite ones. Anthony Cardno did that one, and he talks about how he, as a kid, had nightmares. He had a recurring problem with nightmares, and that's what that book is all about. Is about a young boy who, has nightmares and connects in with this weird guy from Dreamscape, and where nightmares are real, actual beings, that run around. And Anthony actually found some comfort in those stories and in Jack's art from that book, and it, kind of helped him.
Wow.
As a kid. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. I mean, how often do you hear stories like that? So again, that was the uniqueness that I was going for, and I think we've achieved it.
When you talk about Jack at Marvel in the 60s, obviously there's been a lot of discussion and about, who gets credit for what and how much work was being divided, etc. And you guys obviously kind of steer away from it. It's kind of gets mentioned briefly in passing by a few of the different essays. I'm curious if that was a very conscious decision to kind of keep this more of a celebration, more of a on the lightness side, and not kind of delve into that darker, seedier underbelly of what was really going on and the kind of the dissolution of the the partnership between him and Stan. Was that a very cognizant decision to kind of steer away from that, or was that something you did give some thought to?
It was a very, very conscious decision, and it is actually in my notes to the writers. I didn't have a lot of notes because I wanted them to be themselves and to talk freely, but the one thing that was, the main no-go was, this is not a book to bash Stan Lee. I get it. It's a divisive subject, but you know what? It's been talked about a lot, and it's been handled in many different places, but I did not want my book to be part of that. It was not what this book is about. There's plenty of places to go to if you want to get into that discussion. We didn't want to act like it didn't happen or that controversy is not out there, but for the time that we worked on this book, we were setting it aside because it just was not important to what we wanted to say. It's a celebration of Jack and his work. Stan is mentioned in the book, but we don't get into the who did what thing at all, and everybody adhered to that. They got what I was going for. I got to tell you something, Adam. It's a non-starter. It just you start to get into that, and it just breaks down into people standing on opposite sides of the room with their arms crossed. There's Team Stan and there's Team Jack, and I'm actually on both. I love both guys dearly, and I know for a fact that we would not have the Marvel Universe today and all those characters if Jack and Stan had not worked together, and for many years had not meshed so well. You can't take either guy out of the equation without it all just crumbling and falling apart. And it's very important to remind people that none of us were there. Not one single one of us was there. There's a couple of guys in the book who met Jack and even worked with Jack. Paul Kupperberg wrote the Superpowers miniseries that Jack drew, and I believe Bob Greenberger had interactions with Jack during the time of the Who's Who in the DC universe. But we weren't there in the office when Stan and Jack were plotting the latest issue of Fantastic Four. Both those guys have told their stories, and everybody sees things, from their own perspective and in their own ways. So, but again, it's just a kind of a brick wall these days that I'm just not interested in anymore, and I did not want it to be part of this book, because you know what, it would have ended up being most of the book, and that's not what it's all about as far as I'm concerned. And again, and I want to stress this to everybody, I'm not trying to gloss over that or shuffle it, sweep it under the carpet. I'm just saying that for the time that you're in this book, you are not going to get that. If that's not what you're interested in, then maybe this book is not for you. But there are websites and there are books and there are everything that handle that far, far better than we could ever have handled it.
I'll ask you a nice, easy question to ease us out today. I'm curious, the title of the book, so it's Jack of All Comics. How quickly did that title come to you?
The second choice, if I remember correctly. And don't ask me what the first choice was. If I may throw a little ego out there, I think one of my strengths is coming up with titles. I am very, very proud of all the titles of my books. And I hit upon that, and I dismissed whatever the heck else I was thinking and said, this has got to be it. And I have to tell you, I was so fulfilled and justified when I remember this in the email, because when we first started working on it with all the writers, I did not say the working title or anything like that at all. It was a book about Jack Kirby, and they got it. I remember that time that I sent out the email update, and I said, "Oh, and by the way, as of right now, the title is officially Jack of All Comics." And writer after writer replied to that email saying "Oh my God, that's perfect. I love it." And I was like, okay, then I knew that I had hit upon the right title. And to me, it says everything, and forget about that Jack of all trades, master of none, because that's not what I'm going for. I love it because Jack is in all comics. You can find his legacy in just about every comic out there, and especially at Marvel. You can trace so much back to and let's say it, Jack and Stan, and I absolutely love that. The guy worked in every genre that you can possibly imagine in comics. I can't think of one, that he didn't touch upon, that he didn't work in, that he didn't co-create. He is literally a foundation stone of the industry. He is literally Jack of all comics, so it had to be that title.
Absolutely. Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking so much time today to chat with not just about your book, but obviously your own journey with comics and ending the monthly grind and no longer being a weekly warrior. So I'm sure your shop will miss you. I'm sure you helped put someone through university. So, I'm sure they'll miss you.
Since 1984. That's probably true. Hey, thank you very much. I am so glad you reached out to me. This has been really, really fun. Some of the other interviews that I've done have been with some of the writers of it, so it was kind of nice to have this one to myself. I don't always get that. I don't always have. I'm not always free from Paul Kupperberg. But you know what? When Paul Kupperberg starts to talk and tell stories, you just shut up and listen, and I love it because he is just such a singular. He's like Jack in that. He's a singular personality, and God love him. But again, yeah, thank you. It was nice to have this one all to myself.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much, and you're welcome back. I mean, anytime you want to talk more about comics, maybe I feel like I need to check in on you in 6 months and see if it kept to your.
Yeah, man. Make sure I'm not really depressed, or like I said, out on the street corners, dragging myself down the sidewalk, pulling on people's pant legs, and saying like, "Who's writing Action Comics right now? Does it still have a backup story? I gotta know. I can't show my face in my comic shop anymore."
Well, I may hold you to that, but yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I'd love to come back. Excelsior!